first of all, risks. So we're going to go back to our project risks tab, which is where we put the quick risk in for our schedule. Now we might want to now just add a unique risk for this project, and we could say that this is, you can call it risk ID 1 if you wanted to, or you can call it sausages, it doesn't really matter. But what does it mean to you? So maybe there's a hot market, scarce resources, something like that. And then you could say in the pre-mitigated situation, there's going to be a potential cost impact of, and then we'll leave it on relative, we'll just use percentages. I quite like using things like beta perts and then stretching them, shaping them like something like this. So if there was this scenario, then the minimum might be, say, 105. There's at least 5% cost growth on that. And then the likely would be, say, 10%. Notice how it went red to tell me that that was an invalid input. So I had to get my likely greater than my minimum. And maybe there's an extreme scenario where things get to double the price, something like that. So this might be a fair reflection of how something might behave. So a 5% at least, a 10% cost growth probably, and then a decline, a possibility of things going even as high as 200% or doubling. So that would be a very simple risk that we could add. So now that it's there on the risk register, we could go back to our cost model. And at the moment, that risk, because it's not mapped to anything, it's not mapped to the schedule, and it's not mapped to the cost model yet. So actually, if we ran Monte Carlo simulation at the moment, that risk would have 0 impact. Yes, it would randomize in the background, but because it's not mapped to anything, it would affect nothing in the model. So let's say we want to go to our specialists who are already a little bit pricey, but actually because they're specialists, they're highly sought after. And if you're on a gigantic program, a big mega project, and then there's other mega projects in the region as well, then actually maybe it's difficult to attract and retain these people. So let's click on that column for risks, and then you can see there's a little triangle here. If you click on that kind of hazard triangle, it will now show me all the risks on the risk register that have a cost impact. So not a schedule impact only. So do you remember I took the quick risk and I untoggled the cost impact, and I can actually no longer see it here. But if I'd left it toggled on, I'd see the quick risk in here too. But click it, add it across to this one, hit OK, and now it's mapped and you can see it here. So the other thing when we're talking about risks is it an estimating uncertainty that happens all the time, 100% of the time, or is it what we think of as being like a standard or a discrete risk event, which may happen some of the time? So you might say 20% of the time, this scenario, this what if this scenario happens, comes into play. So if we now go back to our cost model, and what I'd like to do is click on that line item, but go back to risks. So this window down here now has 1 risk added. We could have used this as an alternative way of mapping it, by the way. There's a little hazard symbol for mapping risks like we did a moment ago. So you can do it via the column or do it by this window. If you start adding up other risks in here, just beware that the default is for cost to layer on top of other costs, just like they would on a spreadsheet. So we would want to see these occurring in series to each other, not in parallel, typically speaking. Parallel has more relevance on a schedule because you might have 5 risks mapped to a single activity, but if they all happened at the same time, would you notice the delay being caused by some of the smaller ones when there's some risks having a greater effect? So that's when you use parallel, and it just takes the impact of the greatest of all 5, say, whereas in series all 5 happens and they all stack their impact one on top of the other until you get this great big accumulated impact. So in costs you tend to see these things happen in series, but in schedule you tend to use the parallel, just as a rule of thumb. Not always the case, but as a rule of thumb. So you can always use the override button here now and say, well, let's say the risk owner is Jeff, and Jeff is not in work, he's got COVID, and there's change management is occurring, and you are aware of what's coming, and that the scenarios are changing, and so actually the likelihood is increased to 50%. Because actually we're going to need more specialists because the client has requested that we change the scope of the project midway through the project, and actually we're going to need more specialists. So it's now gone to 50% or 100% or whatever it might be. So you could run a Monte Carlo what if scenario by using this override without actually changing what's held on the project risk register itself, which is where the official assessment of the risk is. So you could do that if you ever needed to. But what I wanted to actually show you was this here, the cost impact. So now this line item of specialists that we have for 500 is the price with a plus or minus, so 20% saving, 50% cost growth, because we don't know how much they're going to cost because we haven't gone to market yet, we haven't procured them yet. We think we're going to need 2 of these specialists, but we might need more or less. So you can see that these distributions for base price and then the quantity are here, but now we've also added risk ID number 1 for this kind of hot market situation where actually it's difficult to attract and retain. So we've now got a 20% probability of also adding in this distribution shape. So you can see that this is now having an impact on this cumulative or indicative approximate distribution. So if you kept adding more and more risks, you'd see this changing in real time. And similarly, if you had lots of risks and we did that question of do they impact in series or parallel, if you had lots of risks, that would also change what you would see in here. Okay. So that's the only thing left to show here before we start looking at the import export would be to now run the Monte Carlo simulation one last time, and this time going step through on here. So we can see risk ID 1. See how it changed color just there? It was bright red and then it was no longer, and now it is again. So the step through is showing us which iterations of the Monte Carlo simulation, which iterations that is having an impact on. And so you'd be able to see the growth over here on iteration value $1,133. I just click through a few till we get it flagging up in red again. Growth to 2,222. Okay, so you can see that that is having an impact. Just hit complete on the simulation. And it might just be worth showing you not only if we click on the specialist, you'll be able to see that distribution with that long tail for those. Sometimes things are going to like grow to 200%, twice the expected value. But if you ever need to see which iterations, you can always go to your data view on the distribution graph. Click this button, and you can now see risk ID 1, and wherever you see a little dollar sign like that, that's where there was an impact. In fact, if you click on that, I think it should. Okay, it doesn't. If I click on the cost, you can rank them from cheapest sampled value all the way up to the other end. If I click on the top of the column header one more time, it'll go to the other end. So I can actually see these are all the times that it did impact and which iteration of the Monte Carlo it impacted on. So if you ever wanted to, you could go and revisit those iterations and see them in a kind of like a read-only mode by just clicking on the schedule version of the same thing and finding that iteration and then clicking on it, and it will actually take you to a read-only view of that, and therefore a read-only view of the cost model on that iteration as well. But when you are in data view, it can be useful to sometimes just hover the mouse button over and it will tell you what the impact was. So that was 127%, whereas this one here was a darker, deeper red color, is 167% cost growth. And if you ever need all of the information and you want to do some other fancy report, there's always the option to just export the data, get it out to a CSV file, or export it to the raw data just to a regular Excel, or if you want the p-values exported. So you've got all those options there as well. And very briefly, you can also see the drivers. So what is influencing, say, the cost most? So the labor specialist price per widget is greatest, then the labor specialist quantity, and then risk ID 1 that we added, which only affects the model 20% of the time, comes in at a rank 4. And if you wanted to get a value on how much the impact these things are actually having, you can always go to your sensitivity analysis, pick a p-value that you care about, and then rerun the simulation, or remove the one risk that we had, and it will tell you exactly how much contribution it was having in terms of cost. Just put it on cost there.
Cool. So video 15 was quite a big topic. You know, it starts introducing the risk register in a very big way. And then you're going to have lots of questions, you know, coming off of that, because risk is a big topic. So I'm going to give you a few pointers of a few other videos that you might want to go see and skip ahead to in this series. So first of all, next one up, video 16, we're talking about cloning projects. So you can do a little bit of what if scenario comparison, that kind of thing. Video 18 you might want to skip to if you're interested in the cost of prolongation for something like a PMO. So it's like a risk, cost of prolongation risk, right? So there's a methodology there. Video 24, we actually start talking much more about correlation, so intra-risk. So lots of different risks on the risk register. One thing maybe it makes another risk more likely to occur, or the severities might be some way positively or negatively correlated. So we cover that off a little bit, video 24. And then there's some alternative thoughts on correlation in video 27, where if you link the same risk to multiple cost elements, etc., then there's maybe going to be degrees of correlation and behavior in the model. So those are 4 videos that you might want to go and look at next.